Somewhere inside a 6-mile tunnel through the Rocky Mountains, a German locomotive is losing power, and the crew has no idea why. The temperature in the cab is climbing past anything they have ever experienced on a train. The air tastes wrong, and the machine that was supposed to be the most advanced diesel locomotive ever built in Europe is slowly cooking itself from the inside out. The hydraulic transmission that was supposed to revolutionize American railroading is now running on fluid that has gotten so hot it is starting to turn into vapor. And when hydraulic fluid turns to vapor, you do not have a transmission anymore. You have a very expensive piece of German engineering that is going absolutely nowhere. This is the story of how Southern Pacific and the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad looked at their fleet of American diesels, decided they were not powerful enough, and went shopping in West Germany for something better. What they bought was the Krauss-Maffei ML-4000, a locomotive that promised 4,000 horsepower from a company that had spent the war building tanks and half-tracks for the German military. The same factory that had used thousands of forced laborers and prisoners of war during the conflict was now selling its finest engineering to American railroads. And for a while, it actually worked. The problem with American railroads in the late 1950s was that pulling heavy freight over mountain passes required a ridiculous number of locomotives. Southern Pacific was running trains over the Sierra Nevada with 8, sometimes 10 units lashed together just to get the tonnage over the grade. Every one of those locomotives had 16 cylinders and 4 traction motors, which meant a single train might have 160 pistons firing and 40 electric motors spinning at the same time. Those traction motors were burning out constantly because of the sustained high loads on mountain grades, and the maintenance bills were eating into whatever profit the railroad was trying to make. Krauss-Maffei had a different idea. Instead of using electric traction motors to move the wheels, they used a hydraulic transmission built by Voith. 2 massive Maybach V16 diesel engines would spin torque converters filled with special fluid, and that fluid would transfer power directly to the axles without any electric motors to burn out. The Germans had been running diesel hydraulic locomotives successfully in Europe for years, and they were convinced the technology would work in America. On paper, the ML-4000 could produce 4,000 horsepower from a single unit, which was nearly double what any American builder was offering at the time. Southern Pacific looked at those numbers and saw a future where 3 German locomotives could replace 8 American ones. In July of 1961, Krauss-Maffei tested the prototype on the Semmering Railway in Austria, a stretch of track with grades over 2.5% that winds through the Alps. The locomotive pulled heavy trains up those grades without breaking a sweat, and the American railroad officials who witnessed the tests were impressed enough to sign the contracts. On Halloween of that same year, the first 6 units arrived at the port of Houston, looking like nothing American railroaders had ever seen before. The streamlined silver bodies with their turret-style cabs seemed almost futuristic compared to the boxy American diesels, and photographers gathered to capture the moment these machines rolled onto American rails for the first time. The early results were genuinely promising. On flat territory across Texas and the San Joaquin Valley, the Krauss-Maffei locomotives performed exactly as advertised. 3 of them could do the work of 8 F7s. The cabs were quieter than anything American crews had experienced, and the smooth hydraulic transmission made for a comfortable ride. Southern Pacific ordered 15 more units, and the future of diesel hydraulic power in America seemed assured. Then, they sent them into the mountains. The tunnels through the Sierra Nevada and the Rockies presented a problem that nobody in Munich had anticipated. When a locomotive enters a long tunnel, it acts like a piston in a cylinder. The train pushes hot exhaust gases ahead of it. Those gases hit the tunnel ceiling and roll back toward the locomotive, and suddenly the engine is trying to breathe air that is contaminated with its own exhaust. American diesel electrics handled this reasonably well because their air intakes were positioned to minimize the problem. The Krauss-Maffei units had their air intakes on the roof of the locomotive, which meant they were sucking in the hottest, most contaminated air in the entire tunnel. But the real catastrophe was happening inside the transmission. German locomotives on the Deutsche Bundesbahn ran at full throttle maybe 10% of the time. American mountain railroads ran at full throttle 45% of the time. Krauss-Maffei had designed the cooling system for German conditions. When you run at full power nearly half the time through tunnels at 9,000 feet, the cooling system cannot keep up. The fluid that was supposed to transfer thousands of horsepower to the wheels was getting thinner and thinner as the temperature climbed. In the worst cases, it would start to boil and flash into vapor, and at that point, the transmission simply stopped working. The locomotive would lose power in the middle of a pitch-black tunnel with no way to move itself. Crews reported sitting in stalled locomotives for extended periods, waiting for rescue. The Denver and Rio Grande Western crews started calling them damned Krauts. The railroad tried to modify their 3 units with better air intakes, but eventually concluded that the machines were simply not rugged enough for heavy service over mountainous territory. They sold all 3 to Southern Pacific in early 1964, which left Southern Pacific holding the entire American fleet of these problem locomotives. Southern Pacific gave up on running them over the mountains and relegated them to flat territory where they actually worked fine. The railroad's official verdict was that they were unsatisfactory in service over the Sierra Nevada, but fairly reliable with only 1 recorded failure when kept on level ground. The problem was that Southern Pacific had not bought these locomotives to run across flat valleys. They had bought them to conquer mountains, and for that purpose, they were a complete failure. In 1966, Electromotive Division responded by introducing the SD40 and the SD45 with their new 645 engine series. These American locomotives could produce 3,000 to 3,600 horsepower with proven diesel-electric technology that did not have any of the cooling problems that had crippled the German machines. By the early 1970s, EMD had taken the lesson further with the SD45T2 and the SD40T2, which railroaders called tunnel motors because their air intakes had been moved to the bottom of the locomotive body, specifically to avoid the exhaust contamination problem that had plagued long mountain tunnels. By 1968, Southern Pacific had ended its diesel hydraulic program entirely, and every single Krauss-Maffei locomotive was pulled from service. Most were scrapped, their trucks salvaged for use on maintenance equipment. Only 1 unit survived, number 9010, which Southern Pacific converted into a camera car for filming railroad scenes. That locomotive sat in storage for decades until the Pacific Locomotive Association acquired it and spent years restoring it to operating condition. In February of 2017, the rear Maybach engine started for the first time in 48 years. By 2019, the locomotive was running again on the Niles Canyon Railway, fully restored and operational. The Krauss-Maffei story is not really about German engineering failing in America. It is about what happens when you design a machine for one set of conditions and then operate it somewhere completely different. Those locomotives were built for a railroad system where full throttle operation was rare. They landed on railroads where full throttle was normal, 10% versus 45%. That gap in operating philosophy was something no German precision could bridge.